Helen went from celebrated author to public pariah overnight when the original writer of her best-selling memoir provided proof that Helen had stolen every word. Book signings were canceled, interviews were pulled, and her literary reputation was destroyed by plagiarism accusations. But the worst part wasn't losing her book deal or her reputation. It was discovering that she'd unknowingly destroyed the life of a struggling writer whose work had been stolen and published under Helen's name without her knowledge. See, we think plagiarism is about lazy students copying from Wikipedia or writers deliberately stealing famous works. But what I learned from Helen's story is that literary theft can be so sophisticated that even the plagiarist doesn't know they're stealing. And entire publishing systems can be built on fraud that destroys both the real writers and the unwitting accomplices. Helen thought she was living every writer's dream: bestseller status, media interviews, literary success. She never imagined that her triumph was built on someone else's stolen words and that her success was destroying the life of the person who actually wrote her book. Let me tell you about Helen Morrison from Seattle. She's 48 years old, works as a marketing consultant, divorced for 5 years, and had always dreamed of becoming a published author. For decades, Helen had tried to write the memoir about overcoming her difficult childhood, but could never find the right words or structure. Helen grew up in foster care, experienced abuse and neglect, and had struggled with the emotional aftermath throughout her adult life. She believed her story could help other survivors, but translating trauma into readable narrative proved more challenging than she'd expected. I must have started that memoir 50 times, Helen tells me. I had the experiences, the emotions, the message I wanted to share, but I couldn't organize it into a compelling book. Every draft felt disjointed or too painful to finish. Helen attended writing workshops, hired writing coaches, and spent thousands of dollars trying to develop her storytelling skills. She made progress, but still felt like her memoir lacked the polish and emotional resonance she'd read in published memoirs. I knew my story was important, but I also knew I wasn't a natural writer, Helen explains. I could create marketing copy for businesses, but personal narrative required different skills that I was still developing. 3 years ago, Helen hired a new literary consultant, Patricia Wells, who claimed to specialize in helping trauma survivors write compelling memoirs. Patricia's credentials were impressive. Published author, former editor, testimonials from successful clients. Patricia understood my story immediately, Helen says. She said she could help me organize my experiences into a powerful narrative that would resonate with readers and publishers. What Helen didn't know was that Patricia had already written Helen's memoir by stealing it from another writer entirely. Helen's collaboration with Patricia seemed like a breakthrough. Patricia helped Helen organize her memories chronologically, identify the most compelling incidents, and develop themes that would appeal to memoir readers. Patricia was incredible, Helen recalls. She'd take my rambling stories about foster care and abuse and help me see the narrative structure, the character development, the emotional arc that would make it readable. Over 6 months, Helen and Patricia worked together to craft what became Broken But Not Defeated, a foster child's journey to healing. Helen provided the experiences and emotions, while Patricia helped with organization, pacing, and literary technique. I felt like Patricia was bringing out the writer I'd always wanted to be, Helen explains. She'd suggest phrasings that captured exactly what I'd experienced but couldn't express. She helped me find my voice. When the memoir was complete, Patricia helped Helen find an agent and publisher. The publisher loved the book, advanced sales were strong, and media outlets wanted interviews. It felt like my dreams were finally coming true. Broken But Not Defeated was published to positive reviews and strong sales. Helen appeared on morning shows, did book signings, and received letters from readers whose lives had been changed by her story. Within 6 months, the memoir hit 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Helen earned over $500,000 in royalties and was invited to speak at conferences about trauma recovery and memoir writing. Helen's literary success ended abruptly when she received a certified letter from attorney Sarah Chen representing writer Emma Rodriguez. The letter accused Helen of stealing Emma's unpublished memoir and demanded immediate cessation of all sales and marketing. I thought it was a frivolous lawsuit from someone trying to claim credit for my success, Helen recalls. I'd lived those experiences, told those stories. How could someone else claim to have written my memoir? But the evidence Emma provided was devastating. She had time-stamped digital files of the complete manuscript dating back 4 years, detailed outlines and character development notes, and even early drafts showing the evolution of specific scenes that appeared in Helen's published book. Emma's documentation showed that she'd written every chapter, every scene, every emotional revelation that I thought Patricia had helped me craft. Helen explains, the book wasn't mine at all. It was Emma's stolen work. The investigation revealed that Patricia Wells was not a legitimate literary consultant. She was part of a publishing fraud scheme that stole unpublished manuscripts from unknown writers and helped established or marketable authors publish the stolen work under their names. Patricia had convinced me that the words and structure I was struggling to find had come from our collaboration, Helen says. But actually, she'd given me Emma's complete manuscript and convinced me I'd developed it with her help. Emma Rodriguez was a struggling single mother who had spent 3 years writing her memoir about growing up in foster care. She'd submitted it to multiple agents and publishers, but hadn't found representation when Patricia's organization stole her work. When Helen called me after learning about the plagiarism accusations, I heard something that cut deep. The voice of someone whose greatest achievement had been built on someone else's stolen dreams. Helen, I told her, you're dealing with a betrayal that's more complex than simple plagiarism. You were used as a front for literary theft, and both you and Emma are victims of the same fraud scheme, even though you benefited from her stolen work. I shared with her something I learned about intellectual property theft. When criminals steal creative work, they often find legitimate people to serve as the authors, because established figures can market stolen work more effectively than the criminals themselves. But I also understood her devastation. You're questioning everything you thought you knew about your writing ability, your success, and your integrity. But Helen, you were manipulated by professionals who specialize in convincing people they've created work they actually stole. I explained to Helen the difference between deliberate plagiarism and being used for literary fraud. Deliberate plagiarists know they're stealing. You were convinced that stolen work was your own collaboration with a writing coach. That's fraud victimization, not plagiarism. Helen asked me how she could possibly make things right with Emma while protecting herself from criminal charges. I told her, your best protection is complete honesty about how you were deceived, and your best redemption is helping Emma get justice for the theft of her work. Over the next 8 months, Helen and I worked together on what I call fraud recovery and literary justice, acknowledging the harm caused by unwitting participation in literary theft while seeking justice for both the original author and the unknowing accomplice. First, we addressed Helen's legal and ethical responsibilities. You benefited financially from Emma's stolen work, and you need to make that right regardless of whether you knew about the theft. Restitution isn't just about legal liability, it's about moral responsibility. Helen immediately stopped all book sales and marketing and began working with attorneys to transfer royalties and rights to Emma. Second, we focused on exposing the fraud scheme. Patricia Wells and her organization are still operating, stealing from other writers and using other authors to publish stolen work. Your experience can help law enforcement shut down this scheme. Helen cooperated fully with FBI investigations into the literary fraud ring, providing evidence that helped identify multiple cases of manuscript theft. Third, we worked on Helen's path forward. Your genuine experiences and story are still valuable, even though the stolen book wasn't yours. You can rebuild your writing career based on your authentic voice and real collaboration with legitimate professionals. 10 months after the plagiarism discovery, Helen achieved something she thought was impossible. She found a way to honor Emma's work while building her own legitimate writing career. I realized that my shame about being used for literary theft was less important than Emma getting credit for her brilliant work, Helen explains. My job was to make sure she got the recognition and compensation she deserved. The breakthrough came when Helen and Emma met in person to discuss the case. Instead of enemies fighting over stolen work, they became allies fighting the system that had victimized them both. Emma and I realized we were both victims of Patricia's fraud scheme, Helen says. Emma lost her work and recognition while I lost my integrity and reputation. We decided to fight the real criminals together. Helen's redemption included significant actions. Within a year of the plagiarism discovery, Helen transferred all book royalties and rights to Emma, totaling over $500,000. She testified in federal court against Patricia Wells and the literary fraud organization. Helen helped FBI investigators identify 23 other cases of manuscript theft by the same group. She established a legal fund to help writers protect their intellectual property. Helen wrote a legitimate memoir about being unknowingly used for literary fraud. She became an advocate for stronger protections against publishing industry fraud. Patricia Wells was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for intellectual property theft and fraud. The publishing house that knowingly participated in the scheme paid millions in settlements to victimized writers. What Helen taught me through her literary fraud experience is that the publishing industry includes predators who exploit both aspiring writers and unknowing accomplices in sophisticated theft schemes. Here's what every writer and reader needs to know about protecting intellectual property. First, be extremely cautious about writing consultants or coaches who seem to transform your work dramatically or help you develop content that doesn't feel authentically yours. Second, legitimate collaboration involves building on your original ideas and voice, not providing you with complete content that you couldn't have created independently. Third, if your writing success seems unusually rapid, or your work receives immediate acceptance that's disproportionate to your experience, investigate whether the content is authentically yours. Fourth, writers should document their creative process with time-stamped files, email communications, and development notes that can prove authorship if disputes arise. Fifth, publishers and agents have ethical obligations to verify that submitted work is original and authored by the person claiming credit. Sixth, when literary fraud is discovered,
Both the original author and the unknowing accomplice can be victims of the same criminal scheme. 7th, restitution for literary theft should include financial compensation and public acknowledgement of the real author's work. 8th, legal protections for intellectual property are only effective if writers understand how to document and defend their creative work. If you're involved in writing, publishing, or literary representation, remember what Helen learned. The publishing industry's focus on marketable authors can create opportunities for criminals to steal work from unknown writers and use established figures to legitimize the theft. Helen lost her bestseller status but gained her integrity by ensuring Emma received credit and compensation for her stolen work. Emma's memoir was republished under her own name and became an even bigger success when readers learned about the theft and recovery. Patricia Wells lost her freedom and her fraud scheme was dismantled, but dozens of writers had their work stolen before the criminals were stopped. That's not just recovering from literary fraud, that's transforming fraud discovery into industry reform. Remember this, authentic success takes time to develop, and overnight literary achievement should be examined carefully to ensure it's based on original work rather than stolen content. Helen learned what every aspiring author needs to learn. Your authentic voice and genuine experiences are more valuable than any stolen work, even if developing that authenticity takes longer than fraud schemes promise. Y'all remember that? Your real story told in your authentic voice is worth more than any bestseller built on someone else's stolen words. The success that comes from your genuine work will last, while success from stolen content will always be exposed and destroyed. When you discover you've been used for literary theft, your character is defined by how you respond to that discovery, not by the theft itself.